And he is Tim Tatton-Brown, sort of noted buildings archaeologist, polymath, mountaineer, sort of volcanologist, geologist, etc., and very, very widely published and immensely experienced in matters of archaeology. And this is actually what he's going to talk about this evening. He's going to talk about some investigations, archaeological investigations, with which he was actually involved some 50 years ago, which is on the north side of the Thames, the London Customs House site, as it obviously subsequently becomes known, quite celebrated. And he actually sent me as an attachment, an article from the Times from 1973, which actually is about this very matter at the time when archaeology was actually sort of quite interesting and hot news as far as the national press was concerned. Over to you, Tim.
Now, so I don't have to speak to any of these. Right, well, I'm afraid this is going to be one of my sort of lectures, and I'm getting pretty senile now. I'm deaf in this ear, and this ear is not very good. I never read a lecture nowadays because my eyesight is so bad, but at least I can just about see my notes. Also, I can be really arrogant and say the main meat of this was published in the London Middlesex Society Transactions 1974, 1975. These are my off-prints, so if you want the detail and all the finds which we published, they're there. I was also told by some people I should just spend the whole time telling anecdotes about what went on the site, which I could do non-stop, but I thought best, and I should say the PowerPoint was made by my youngest son, who understands those sort of things, and what he did was to put in a series of the drawings that I did that are all published, and I think you will be able to see some of them, but when they were very big fold-outs that you're allowed to use in those days, you do that, you may find there's a strip and you can't see it because it's reduced too much. But you don't need to worry because you can do the details. I've also, and probably I shouldn't have done that, been going through my old diaries of 50 years ago, so I can even tell you exact day, for example, when the staff of the Institute of Archaeology turned up on the site and all sorts of people, and particularly where I first started to learn about timber from Cecil Hewitt, Stuart Rigold, and people like that who you will know who they were, but the younger generation had never heard of. Riggy, as we always called him, always used to sit here, and a great mentor of mine. So I've got all of that, but I'm going to try, and I know I need to put my watch here, because the party is what really matters at 6 o'clock, and just say something about the site. So, could someone change it for me, or is there a button? Shall I just say next? Is that the best?
You can only, if you say next, I'm going to be jumping up and down.
Oh, no, sorry, no, right, tell me, but that's the button. Right.
That's on.
Yep.
You know, heaven forbid if you need to go back.
No, I don't think I dare unless someone asks a difficult. Oh, yes, and that's embarrassing because I found that the other day and my son chucked it in. That, I think, is the first time I had to lecture in this theatre when it was much better than now. It had old boxy seats, and probably because I'm so deaf now, the acoustic was much better, I thought, and so on and so forth. And all I could say I remember when I saw that is that just as I was about to start, whenever that was, 51 years ago, Sir Mortimer Wheeler walked in and sat where Martin Hennig is, and I was very unnerved. I should say that he had his office at the back here in the old British Academy where he was the secretary, and he was a wonderful man who was one of my patrons. He sent me on my first dig in Italy in 1966 with Molly Cotton at a Roman villa. So he was a remarkable man, but again, I think today he's either forgotten or is supposed to be a sexist pig, as someone described him in one of the newspapers, I think. So less said the better, but he did a lot for me. I should also say that this could never have happened but for one person who I want to remember again tonight, Hugh Chapman. Many of you will know exactly who Chapman is, but I must just get my notes and tell you the exact dates of Hugh. Here we are. Hugh Chapman died on the 22nd of June, 1992, aged 46, when he was a new secretary here, General Secretary at the Antiquaries, and had been at the Guildhall Museum that then became the Museum of London. And without him, I wouldn't have been doing this, or I wouldn't have probably even been digging in Britain, because before that, I was lucky. I went and excavated in Knidos in Turkey. I went back there amazingly 3 months ago. And in Libya, well, yes, as you can see, I had to do this lecture, and Carthage and other places. But Hugh just said to me in June of 73, how would you like to stay and do a dig in London? And I said, yes. He said, well, you've got to start it probably next week or in a few weeks' time. And that's what happened. And the excavation was the very last excavation undertaken by the Guildhall Museum before the Museum of London legally came into being on the 1st of December. And then it also got the new DUA that then became MOLA, MOLAS, and all of those sort of things. And I still remember it started officially when Brian Hobley turned up on my site to have his picture taken for the Sunday Times, I think it was, as the new great boss of the DUA. So what I was asked to do, and gosh, I was lucky to be asked by Hugh. I should say I first met Hugh with Mark Hassel when we were both digging for Mark in Gloucester in 1966. And I'd known him well, and we're all Romanists, you see, in those days. We didn't know anything about later stuff, like Martin, you see, over here. And it just set off, for me, what was incredibly hard work, because, again, I won't read all the statistics, but basically we had about 3 or 4 months before the piles were going to go in, and they were putting up this new building on the site. Sorry, next one, let's just go straight away. Oh, no, wait, no. Okay. Oh, that's good, because then I can... Right. Thank you, John. Yep, no. Right, I put these on because these are scanned from my slides, and I couldn't resist saying, this is where we had our tea break. When we dug so quickly, you see, you go from, you know where we are. Next one then, please. I'm not allowed to... There's, I think, the Golden Hind replica or something sailed in. Next one then. Belfast, before it was repainted, everything in the background and on our side of the river, all gone. All those warehouses were knocked down. Subsequent, Harvey Sheldon, others dug there. Next one, please. And then this iconic view to me, looking back towards Southwark and London Bridge, and a little smoking chimney. I dare not say what that building is now. We're still operating and polluting London. Next. So this one, yes, I've got to make sure some are a bit smaller, just shows you where the site was. Unique site, as soon as and I knew nothing about it before. It's only about a couple of 100 yards west of the modern, still the entrance to the Tower of London, the great custom house. And by the way, I was told virtually on day one, it's not a customs house, it's a custom house without an S. And the great building, everybody will know, I think it's now ceased to be Inland Revenue and Customs and so on. But this extraordinary site there, and the area marked on it, shaped with diagonal lines, is the basements of Victorian warehouses, next one please, that were being demolished while we were working on the site. That would be never allowed under health and safety. So when I turned up, they knocked down half the buildings, and they were still knocking down the buildings. And one of the great helpers of the early days was someone I remember well called Chris Henry, who's head of the biggest demolition business in London. He knocked down everything that was required. And he was wonderful to us. I mean, it was easy because basically you got to clear everything and take it away. So when I said, could you take that spoil heap away there because it's getting in our way? Fine. Could you break up the basements, which is the only places where we could dig anyway because of the huge depth? He'd dig it out and get someone to break up the concrete floor. Then we could do our digs. And he and I even, gosh, I'm going to do one anecdote now anyway. I remember one day he turned up in his white Rolls Royce on the site and said to the site foreman, why haven't you knocked the wall down along the frontage with Thames Street? And he said, oh, no, the police won't let us because it's too near where the cars are parked. He said, yeah, knock it down. So I said, well, you're the boss. And so they knocked it down. Huge dust went up, and the cars had about 2 inches of dust. And the police came on the site. He'd gone, of course. He'd driven off with his Rolls Royce, chauffeur driven. And I said to the woman, what are you going to do? He said, oh, he'll be given a big fine for that. But we had it on the bill. And that was the bad old days of digging. Now, getting down to serious things, luckily I was a geologist before I started this, a failed geologist, because I didn't want to go into North Sea oil. And I was exceptionally lucky to have boreholes and things like that to use straight away. So we knew the main part of the site to the south was far too deep, going 20, 30 feet down. And the only places where we could dig are the northern basements. And that just shows you, and you'll see in a minute, the sequence of levels. The key thing is OD, Ordnance Datum, Newlyn, and all the rest of it. Later, as you can see, I put in, because I didn't know about it till a little bit later on while we were digging, the city wall of London. There was no Roman city wall on the south side. That's what we were told didn't exist. Ran all the way around. Everybody could walk around there. It didn't exist. But of course, what we just found and then was found in the subsequent years, complete river wall going along. So that's key. But what we then did manage to do was start at about 2 meters above OD and dig trenches with huge concrete walls. So we didn't need shuttering or, luckily, or any special protection to do it. And in places, next one I think, please, we managed to get down to trenches that were 15 feet deep. That wouldn't be allowed now. And some of our best diggers, I think including Gus probably, wherever he is, could use a shovel and could shovel up into a wheelbarrow that was about 13 or 14 feet above. And it was an art to do this and land it perfectly in the wheelbarrow. And so basically all we dug where the trenches are shown on these two summary plans. On the right, which is where we really did hit the jackpot because there were few timbers of that sort had been found elsewhere in London, and famously, Stuart Rigold told me later in Dover, the Roman harbour in Dover in the 1880s, we found this amazing series of timber waterfronts, and then at the higher level, which this again shows you the overall plan, we found timber waterfronts, which I'm going to say a little bit about, and amazingly the corner of a 14th century building, which must be the medieval custom house, like probably the building put up in 1382 by churchmen when Chaucer was actually working there, but we'll come to that in a minute. Next, please, John. Oh yes, that I couldn't resist putting that in because that's what I then drew, I think it's 74, when I was 100% certainly was there, and that's of course then when it was all found, not only Baynard's Castle, but all the way along there, and famous now, and it's just, I'm told, now become a scheduled ancient monument, though there's very little where the public can go and see it. So that's the context of where we were, bottom right, as you can see. Next, please. Starting, the bottom, the earliest levels were bits of masonry and timbers of Roman waterfronts. And to start with, there wasn't very much. And, oh yes, and subsequently, the piles there, I found, were the piles underneath where the late Roman wall had been, right up in the top corner. I didn't say that we were not allowed to dig very close to Lower Thames Street, because there was no shoring or other things, so we had to dig further back. In the excavation has taken place on this site in 2016, not yet published. They were able to do a bigger area. Next, please. And these, and I couldn't find, some are still missing. These are my old slides, just a few, of the site which I had scanned a few years ago. The real thing is it was black because everything was full of peat and organic material, and that's the beginning of uncovering the Roman quays at the lower level. Next, please. And again, though this is a pull-out, I'm afraid, so you can't see that. But the main thing, you see the box frame ran right across there, and then it had been pulled forward and partly removed on the right-hand side. Next one. And that was a good example of an isometric, which I drew just because it's a better way to show what we can uncover. I should say some of that has survived. We only dug, obviously, down to the bottom of it in that one box because we had such a short period of time. And so that section, obviously, is a composite through there. But much of the site, even at this depth, this is about 2 meters below OD, the piles that then went in from October, and I watched them being corkscrewed in, went down 102 feet, if I remembered correctly. Little man had to get in a cage and go down to the bottom, check it was okay before they put in the steels and the concrete. So when you see the later, the 2016 thing, you'll find it's full of great rings destroying everything. And the higher levels, the medieval ones, are mostly destroyed. Next, please. Oh, that's again just technical things. This is what I've started to learn from Cecil Hewitt and people, how the joints worked. I won't go into all the technicalities he taught me, but this is typical of the Roman joints. Thanks. Next one. And then we come to the medieval levels. Again, initially, we suddenly found great braced waterfront structures like that. Next one, please. And amazingly, one of them had 2 large chunks of a ship used behind it. And in perfect condition, you see the roves were all there. Next one, I think I've got a detail. Yeah, that's my drawing of the back. And you can see there are parts of the hulls of, well, I won't say Graveney boat or Sutton Hoo, except they don't have all the, well, Graveney boat did, but the sort of timbers with the roves. We have those sort of roves in the 13th century, as it happens, on the inside of the west doors of Salisbury Cathedral. So they're not, as we were told, ships carpenters built all of Salisbury Cathedral's carpentry. That's the old myth. Next one. And yes, here, most of the pictures are black and white. Jeff Denford did some very good, very difficult to take black holes, you know, with black and white. So that shows you, again, part of that structure. Next, please. I'll just grab the... Yeah, and that's just a detail to show you the clinker building of the timbers with the rows. Next, please. So the medieval waterfronts are what we found here. Again, we only dug in these trenches, but you could obviously do dots to join up the waterfront. And you can just see at the very top there the beginning of another series of braces to an earlier waterfront, which we found were basically into 13th, 14th century. I won't go into the details of the dating probably much tonight because Dendro started in London here when John Fletcher came here, and we obviously had provisional dates and the Roman ones were changed from his original work, but it was the beginning of John Fletcher's work at the Oxford Dendro Lab. That was particularly interesting. Next one I think I've got on the left-hand side. Oh no, this is just showing again what we were uncovering. This is where the braces had been pulled out and there were lots of lovely joints. And this is again when Cecil Hewitt would come and say, oh, it's a trait to Jupiter scarf. Now, how many people know what a trait to Jupiter scarf? It's very simple. It's a lightning bolt. That's the trait of Jupiter. and it's what is called splayed and table. And so you have that, where you've got two, and I haven't got a stick point, but you can see one of those there, and all sorts of other nice terms, which I was taught by the wonderful Cecil, long dead now. Next, please. And then here, from that was what we were looking at before, where it had been pulled out, but here's where the whole waterfront pretty well was intact. Let's go on to the next one then, please, John. That's typical of what has been found many times since along the waterfront. And the extraordinary thing you see is that behind it was rubbish, which was thrown into these from the streets of London. And though we published an awful lot, we didn't publish everything. It's absolutely full of magnificent finds, pottery, the lot, particularly leather, all sorts of things because of the it all being effectively waterlogged. I should also possibly say here that, though I'm not allowed to say too much about this, that I always used what Wheeler had told us all those years before. You have trenches and layers. As soon as the new Museum of London came, in came what I still don't like, dare I say it, which is the Harris matrix, single context, and all of that. For deep trenches like this, I thought, can't work. So all mine had a Roman figure, trench number, and a layer. And that's why, carry on, John, next one, please. Yes, and these ones, you see, that was doing an isometric, I think, on that one that I did to show how it actually worked and where it had been pulled out. Next one, please. And then again, here we are. This is where Cecil was teaching me the different type, because he said, well, you've got to look at it, and he'd get his knife out and poke the joint to see how it worked underneath. And he was famous for that, and he'd talk about secret notch-lap joints and so on, which nobody could see until you poked it with a knife and felt the back of the joint. And it's that sort of thing that I have never forgotten. Next, please. Then, amazingly, the northwest corner of our trenches on the northern side, we couldn't dig further north, we found these chalk and ragstone rubble foundations, typical, as we found later, when you have wet stuff. They didn't waste time on digging huge foundation trenches, they made arches in them. And what we had was two stages of a building, this, which had clearly abutted an earlier building on the left, and yes, and I put later addition. Next one, I think, please. Oh yes, this I couldn't resist. This was on the front of the London Archaeologist with Sinead Alban Jones. I can't remember what she's called now, but doing recording there. So you can see the sort of chaos of the site and the basement we worked in and the new custom house in the distance. Next one then, please. That's my mundane, more mundane one, when the tea break was taking place. And I put that on, that's the same. You see, we're looking west along what we will see in a minute is the front wall of the 14th century custom house. Note on the left, the pump. Every day, when we got to the lowest levels, we had to pump out a vast amount of water. We ended up, I think, with several pumps before we could even start digging, because we were, I think, sometimes as much as 25 feet below the mean tide, almost to the lowest tides. And we had to get it all out. So the pump was absolutely essential, as well as ladders to get in and out of the trench itself. Next one, please. Here's the key bit in the corner, because not only this is the southeast corner of the custom house site, as later on it was, not only did we have the piles going in there, but amazingly, there was a drain running alongside it. And there is the cross-section. You can see, though, the planks on the top, it was made of elm, not oak, so you couldn't dendrodate it. The top has sort of fallen in, but you might just see, yes, in the plan, buckler with an arrow, and the cross-section. We'll come to that later. Well, I could say that was the only thing I can use the word unique and say, and if someone knows different, that's the finest buckler ever found in Britain. I don't think anybody's found a buckler since, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Next, please. And there it is, you see. So here's the corner of the extension part of it. There's the great Victorian basement. There's the concrete foundation, which was all gunned out with Chris Henry's men breaking it up for us. So we had all of that. Next one then, please. And that's looking down. You can't see it in the dark, but that's where the area of the drain was. Next one then, please. Going, oh yes, even that's no good. You see it's so dark, but you'll see the drawing in a minute. Next one then, John. This is the reconstruction, which is easy to do because all the timbers were there, even they'd fallen in. And this clearly was running along the main east side, probably with water running through it. There may be a little stream beyond, we know from the later topography I studied in the area to flush it out. So we could straight away say, well, this is probably the loo that Geoffrey Chaucer used. And then, I think the next one, oh no, sorry, later. But the other area in the northeast corner of the site, we could dig closer to Thames Street because do you see the reversed arch brick foundations? This was part of the 18th century Ripley custom house extension added alongside Christopher Wren's, which you might have noticed in the first slide, but I think I have a slide later to show that. So at least we could clear all the rubble out, again, with tremendous help from the demolition people, and then we could start digging below there, and that's where quite a lot of the Roman material was. Next, please. Oh, that's just the first thing, next one. That's the upper levels. I won't talk about the complicated sequence of basically after the medieval custom house, there was Elizabethan custom house of 1559, Great Friar of London, and then Wren's custom house, one of the most short-lived buildings he designed. There we have nice pictures of it, I think I'll show at the end. And then the Ripley rebuilding when it was beginning to move and extension. This just is a good one to show the deepest we got, and we did manage to get, you see, in this trench, sorry, I better stand back, to the natural London clay at the bottom. And that's crucial, what I've shown along there. So we did get right to the natural, and that's about 15 feet below where we were working from in the basement. And that's where some wonderful diggers, and I perhaps was the point at which I say, the first part of the dig was done with about 25 volunteers and a handful of very meagerly paid supervisors and people like that. And then the second part, when we were just given about another couple of months while the first piles were going in, we had a small team working right up to November, so the daylight was very short there, professionally, and they were all paid. But all of this was done by this wonderful group of people. And my star pupil, dare I say it, because he's here, is Gustav Milne, who turned up one day and asked what we were doing, and he was very persistent. And I said, well, come back tomorrow and I'll give you a shovel. And he did. And he didn't leave the waterfront for about 10 years afterwards, and written some splendid books and done lots of stuff which goes beyond what we were doing here. Next one then, please. And then these is where you see you get the earliest Roman timbers here. You see nearly sitting on the London clay, but also with gravel, which we could look at and see the sequence of the rising of the water in the Thames area. The real question was it tidal or not? And the answer is, I think it almost certainly was. And the new work obviously has been done on that. But also, you could actually go from the geology into the early Roman, and then over the top, you see slicing off in the stratigraphy, the immediate post-Roman levels when there was clearly a rising sea level, which was both, gosh, am I allowed to use technical words, isostatic and eustatic, which means basically melting ice. We all know about that. And the other is the ground coming back up, like when you get off a mattress. And southeast England has the biggest amount of that. Scotland's going right up, you see, already. So that showed very clearly in the post-Roman period, from the 4th century right through to the 13th century. There was nothing in between. It was a marine transgression, geologists would call it. So we had literally nothing between the end of the Roman and the medieval, the 13th century. Next, please. And that's, again, that long section showing from the early Roman down, obviously, in the Ripley basement. On the right, this is the Thames Street side, yes. That's the one point when we got to just about Thames Street, you see at the top, behind which we later discovered was the Roman city wall, or at least the base of it. And then this is the whole sequence with the medieval quays gradually pushing out and getting rubbish thrown into them from basically the 13th century. Later on, other digs have found them going back a bit before. Next, please. Here's the star find. Absolutely amazing. The only thing is, I think it's still hidden away in a box somewhere in the Museum of London stores, because if you look at it, it was a bit of rusty old gunge. And because it's wood and iron, both the conservation needed for those two cannot work together. So this was done by, I wish I could remember her name, wonderful artist who drew up this for me, using only X-rays. And that's all you need, because that is exactly what it is. There's the back with the handle. Yeah, and people will know the lateral salter is the most famous example of this you see on the right. And when Gerald Dunning, who came to look at it, who was the expert, he couldn't believe his eyes. He said, I've never seen a complete buckler in my life. And the people from the Tower Armories came over when they were still next door and were staggered. And that point and so on is still there, but entirely covered. Well, maybe I'm wrong, and they've cleaned it up, but it's not been on show. But still covered with rust and gunge, you see. So, but the point was still totally visible in the X-ray. Next, please. And then that was sent to me by somebody recently, you see. So at the October, which was the absolute end of the dig, and Philip Howard came down and did a story. But the key thing there, why I've sort of put it in, is that by this time, John Fletcher had acquired a team from the forestry department in Oxford to come down with chainsaws, because all this was going to be destroyed, to chainsaw out the most important bits of the Roman and the medieval waterfronts. And that's what they did. I think they wrecked most of their chainsaws because they'd never used them before on waterlogged oak. But I'm sure they've refined their work now. And then, amazingly, because not many people remember this, outside the Houses of Parliament is the Jewel Tower. It was full of water. And we had nowhere where we would keep all these large timbers in water. Obviously, the Mary Rose and all the rest of it later on had vast tanks and all the rest of it. So I think it was Stuart Rigold as the senior inspector who came and looked at it and said, oh, well, we'll chuck it in the Jewel Tower moat with all the fish swimming around. So we chained it up onto lorries, helped by the forestry people and John Fletcher, and just put them there. And they remained there till the moat was drained. I can't remember how many years later. And as far as I know, I think they are also in store in the Museum of London, but I've never seen them since. Next one, please. And then this is the first time that the Oxford Dendro lab under John Fletcher, you know, in Archaeology and History of Art in Oxford, came and John Fletcher particularly, and started Dendrochronology. You don't need to see the detail there because it's incorrect in terms of the actual dates there. subsequently, about 4 years later, John Fletcher wrote a little article saying, well, I was 100 or so years out, but that, particularly considering it was pioneering, that was using a teleconnection to the Roman bridges and piles in Germany, in various places there. And once we got more than just these very small beginnings, and particularly Gus will tell you all the sequences that followed. Now we have all the dates. Dan Miles, who runs it brilliantly now, has got dates from whatever it is, 3000 BC onwards, and he can not only date everything and even up to the spring or the autumn of cutting, but I can tell you where they came from. So it's all changed, but I was very lucky to have John Fletcher come on the site and start what has then gone on in London. And it's absolutely brilliant work. It's by far the most important dating technique for people like me. And of course, it's used on these panel paintings here, you see. Dan can have a tiny core and he can date all the panels here, not that closely because obviously they cut the bark off before they made the boards and so on, but that's changed everything, independent dating for the Middle Ages, but also, of course, now the Roman and even into the Anglo-Saxon. Next, please. At the end of the dig, we were, well, I'm going to just see the exact date. I can't resist looking at my notes. We were told that we had to be off, if I can see it, off the site by the 13th of October. And we worked until it got dark and just about completed it all. And then after a short pause, we were told, well, we could do one area in the corner of the site, the northwest area, where they were not starting the piles. The piles were being done at the other end of the site. And that's when we then worked from then until the 19th of November. My diary says finish main work on the site Friday the 16th of November, 5 p.m. in the dark. Final work on the site, washing pottery. Piling starts today. Very cold. And we were washing pot on the site because there was nowhere else. And then we took the site down on the 19th of November. And that's the point at which Hugh Chapman got me a desk in the old Guildhall Museum in Basinghall Street and said, right, now you can write it up. I'm the editor of the London Middlesex Transactions, and I've reserved space for 2 volumes, because it's going to be quite long, and you've got to come here, and we got a drawing board and everything else, so I could draw up my drawings and so on. And amazingly, that's what I was then able to do for the next approximately, except I went off the following summer back to Libya for summer. But anyway, and it was Hugh who drove me on to do that. And then between us, and Hugh particularly, got people, including Dr. Hennig here at the front, to write up the small finds, the Roman pottery, the medieval pottery, everything. And they really worked hard, particularly Wendy McKaiser, Harvey Sheldon's subsequently wife, who did huge work on the Roman coarse pottery. And then people like, obviously, Joanna Bird did the same and all the rest of it. So as far as we could, we were determined to publish it, and that actually worked. And at the same time, as you can just see, I think on that, yes, we were told if you got back on the site quick, in May '74, there were a few other walls. And you can see we tried to fit them in with the foundations of, or with where our trenches were, but unfortunately we couldn't get anything more of the medieval custom house site, which we know extended as far as Water Lane. I hope the new excavations which were done there may find out a lot more. I'm looking forward hugely to the a much fuller excavation, because obviously they had the advantage that all the basements had been ripped out, all the concrete had gone, and it was at a lower level, so much of it was destroyed, but there will be other things which could be found. Next one, please. Yes, and one of them was this great scissor-braced, probably jetty, coming out into the Thames from the Custom House site, the 14th century Custom House site. Next one. And then I had fun, because once we'd done the basic right up, and helped by people obviously in the Guildhall archives and all the rest of it, and then Tony Dyson, who came on the scene as the official first documentary historian for DUA, we then worked this out. And the key thing is, this is rather ironic, is the Tower of London. Because, as you can see, I mean, everybody knows that's what the Tower of London looks like now and what it was like. I think, what's his name, the great chief inspector, had drawn these parts before. Arnold Taylor, another wonderful mentor, which I discussed these with. The key thing was making this new wharf, which obviously then was a batter for what was then being pushed out with the rubbish. And so you can see, in simple terms, what had actually happened was where the Roman city wall was became a key in the late Saxon period. It wasn't always like, it wasn't a straight wall all the way along, but as later sites found out more complications, because of the rise in sea level of 2 or 3 meters. Roughly, I seem to remember the rule of thumb, it was after the marine transgression, it was about 1 foot a century. And it's still, of course, doing that today, but we don't have tides properly now because of the Thames barrier. And so the Anglo-Saxon waterfront was in many places where the late Roman wall was. And it was then from the 13th century, but particularly the context in relation to the Tower of London, that one could see they were really pushing out. And what I then did subsequently, I don't know why, because it never got finished. I don't think it was of much interest in the, dare I say it, the Tower Armories, because obviously they've got other things to do there. When they were digging where, see, I've just dotted it on the outer gate. Well, that was subsequently dug by, Julian, tell me, Oxford Archaeology. I can't remember. Graham Keevil. He dug that, so we know exactly what that gate was, and amazingly, it actually has Purbeck marble foundations, but that's another story. That's because of the water there. So what has not yet been done, dare I say it, I hope there's nobody going to be offended here from the Tower of London, is what we started to look at, the sequence of buildings and the masonry recording of particularly this period. Well, obviously from the 11th century keep, which has been done very well by you know who, and then the outer ones, because they need relating to the OD levels, and particularly when there was this moat which you could regulate from sluices and so on the Thames. So one day when that's done, we'll know a vast amount more about the whole sequence of the rise in sea level in the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, as you know, I think Simon Hurley's idea of putting water in the moat again failed because of the cut and cover tunnel to the north on the district line, and so on and so forth. And now, of course, it's far more important for using for red poppies or whatever. And, you know, that's today. Next one, please. But one day someone will do it. And I can't resist. This is Julian's reconstruction, Julian Munby's reconstruction using the foundation, but also we have a couple of drawings, but I won't go through. There's a whole sequence of early drawings which give you the shape of the building of the medieval custom house site. You see where he's put latrine, there's where the drain was with the buckler in it. Next one, please. And I think I've nearly got to the end, and I know I'm not allowed to go over 550. Subsequently, This, yes, as I mentioned before, you see, this summarizes the change from here. Look, there's even a Viking ship there, and here's a Roman ship based on the County Hall one. You see, that's the big change between the 4th century, well, I won't get in the exact dates, but the 4th century, and then here from the 10th century, when the ships were going alongside the ruined or partially surviving quay there, and you can see I've drawn in the timbers underneath the gravel, and that shows the sequence. And a lot more work now needs doing on all of this in London, particularly with all the wonderful new technology to work out precisely how the Thames changed. Where was the Thames tidal limit? My guess was always it was initially here, the Pool of London, where the Roman bridge went across, but even that we don't know. And why is there the famous so-called Watling Street crossing at Westminster? Is it because, though people have dug trenches in Lambeth Palace, gardens and so on, was that because that was an easy crossing point of the Thames well above the tidal limit? But that really needs doing again. People have started on this, but one thing that hasn't been done. Next one. Yes, I just thought, well, I'll stick these on because this is, as you could see, that wasn't me, well, no. This is obviously the Wren Custom House site, which after obviously the Great Fire was rebuilt, but next one, I won't go into its story, and people have written on it. And of course, we then have the wonderful Ogleby plan showing the new Custom House site there, but it also shows all the medieval topography. And I was a bit of an idiot, but I then decided I wanted to see how the whole of the street pattern in the City of London developed from the late Anglo-Saxon period, and even wrote an article, well, at the request of Glyn Daniel in Antiquity many years ago, because it was the 50th anniversary, I think, of Wheeler's London in the medieval period, his great handbooks for the London Museum. And so I wrote that, but I think that now needs rethinking again as well. Next one, please. This is the Ripley, which is very complicated because there was a lot of movement here, and this needs modern 3D modeling. If people want to do it, probably they're not interested, I suppose. It's a boring building, but this has evolved. It's got bits of the Wren Custom House site and was rebuilt and then enlarged, and the block on the right is certainly what we then managed to work in, the upside-down brick arches, which were the foundations. You see, in the 18th century, they knew how to make inverse arches for foundations. So that was our corner of the site, so to speak. Next one, please. Yeah, and I thought we need some art today, because I know we need to have a nice picture. I couldn't find the colour version of that from the V&A, I'm sorry, but that you see is 1756, Samuel Scott, and that was part of the front with the Ripley in it. Gives you a bit more idea of what was going on in the 18th century and the cranes and all the rest of it. And is the next one the last? Oh no, yes, this one I put in, you see, because in the background, those are the warehouses that were being demolished in 1973. And that's where we start. There is, of course, the successor, the great custom house of the early 19th century, just to the left, but in its sort of final heyday, you see, with the site here and the Tower of London beyond being used as warehouses, which are all around the Pool of London. Is that the last? Oh gosh, right, what did I put in at the end? Oh yes, well, can't read. This is when I went in with Gus, and we went there in 2016. This was one of the holes they dug. This is how to do it properly, you see, with sheep piling around. You can see the great circular rings. Those I watched being put in. That's where they had to drop a man in a little cage down to the London clay to check the bottom was good. over 100 feet down. And those are, again, one bit of it is what I dug before, you see, the Roman quays. But in the foreground, of course, what they could have, because the basements have gone, is the piles for the late Roman city wall, the Roman city wall, the outer face, the north face, full of reused Roman blocks, Lewis holes and things like that, just as many bits were found of this. I'm told this is now all a scheduled ancient monument, only last year, I think. So hopefully, and this is, now that the building's long gone up, you see, that was quite a few years ago. So, but they were able to dig other areas with all the, modern health and safety. Can you imagine my diggers all with high-vis jacks and jackets and helmets? We didn't have any. Right, is that the end, John? It isn't. Oh, go on, quick. Oh, yes, here you are. You've got to put it in. I showed you the Belfast's the same, but it's been pushed out a bit and repainted to look more authentic. Everything on the other side, of course, is subsequent. There's the great London Custom House. I don't even know, is it going to be a hotel? Someone said it probably was. Billingsgate, which we then watched all the work. I mean, how many knew that there was a permafrost underneath Billingsgate, and when they finally turned off the refrigeration, it started to melt the ground. So there you not only had waterlogging, but permafrost from underground refrigeration and so on. But I've said enough. I'm sure that's the end, and I should shut up. That was the last.
Well, I think your fans are well pleased with that, Tim. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I think we had sort of like 52 years of Tim Tatton-Brown in that from the opening. Do we have a roving mic and a microphone rover? Richard, is there
Shout,
lovely.
And I'll hear.
Well, we'll take questions. While you're thinking about your questions, actually, I did have one question, really about the relationship between the quayside and the Roman defensive wall. Would you like to say a little more about that? Is that primarily a flood defence wall?
Sorry, say that again.
The relationship between the Roman quayside and the defensive wall behind it, which sounds an inconvenient arrangement.
Yes.
Is it primarily a flood defensive wall?
No, that's the complicated story which Gustav Milman could tell better, because all I found was obviously, because we had to dig there, we had earlier quays, then they built the defensive wall plonked into it, and then, and you can see from all the subsequent excavations over the next 10, 15 years, how it was built as the whole of the city wall of London, you see, in the later Roman period. So it's plonked down. We didn't find any of the in-between things, and it's a very complicated story. I mean, it was when basically the so-called Saxon shore forts were being built elsewhere, and the Thames was not safe and all the rest of it in the later Roman period. But that's not, because obviously we didn't excavate that area. It's not part of the story now.
Is much known about the openings in the wall?
No.
About where they are?
Well, now you've got me on one of my pet things I've been saying for years, but David over there hopefully might arrange it one day. I would like to dig just to the north of the porch of St. Magnus the Martyr, where the London Bridge, medieval bridge went, because I'm sure that's the Roman line, and there's still two arches of the medieval 12th century bridge are buried there. The point at which the late Roman city wall comes through there, we now know exactly from New Fresh Wharf and other side, is along the north wall of St. Magnus the Martyr. If we could dig under the pavement there, and in the beginning of the area where you go into the porch, there should be a great monumental Roman gate and all the medieval stuff and everything later. Unfortunately, I think the latest is because they make so much money from car parking in that bit of the churchyard, it's not going to happen at the moment. But one day, a research excavation there, and even the other end of St Magnus the Master, because they dug the south aisle of the next church, the St Bodolph Church. The rest of it is under the pavement at Lower Thames Street. So all of that is there for research excavations.
Thank you, Tim. I think Andrew Gray, was that right? You had your hand up? No. Martin certainly has his hand up.
This seems to me, I mean, it was a really historic moment. I remember before this, I think, Professor Grimes told me, who discovered the Temple of Mithras and was rather surprised to have found it. He said, we're never going to know very much about Roman London apart from what I've found because it's too deep. As far as medieval London was concerned, he would have said, well, apart from obviously the bits and pieces that survive, we're never really going to find them because it's not worthwhile. They will be pretty, vestigial. So it was, but this was the first site that gave you the feeling that there was a lot to be found, and probably if your doing the site gave a lot of impetus to what was going to happen later, which would allow this. I mean, in the Sackler Library, if I'm still allowed to call it in Oxford, there are shelves on Roman Britain. The biggest thing the biggest thing on archaeology is London, which has a whole section because of the many, many volumes that mainly Moeller have published. But you are, in a way, the grandfather, or perhaps the father of what...
No, the grandfather was Peter Grimes. I mean, he was I had the huge privilege of being his last president of the Students' Union when he ran the Institute, and he was, I mustn't start it, but he was a wonderful man, and what he achieved in impossible circumstances. He was running the London Museum. He did all this digging and was ruined because of the Mithras discovery. And he really was the person. And then Ralph Merrifield did a vast amount on all the little sites, and particularly the great Forum and Basilica, of course, all these fragments and foundations. So there were a lot of people. No, the only thing I claim is by total luck, because of Hugh, I had the first big bite of the cherry on the waterfront. And poor Peter Marsden was trying to do Baynard's Castle with no money, nothing, and was in an impossible position at the other end. And then, of course, the key thing, another person, I wish he was still here, Tom Blagg, who then, when they found the bit of the city wall in that western part, there were all the chunks of an arch, a Roman arch, all the sculptures, which people remember from the museum, all reused in a hurry in the city, the late Roman city wall there. So there are lots of key things. I was just lucky to get this little opportunity, at the end of the Guildhall Museum era.
Well, they do. Oh, so David Harrison, then Richard Platt.
Well, Tim, thank you. Great talk, and you gave me the opening to talk a little bit about medieval London Bridge. So
yeah.
I can't resist it.
Oh, yes.
So 1921, when they were building Adelaide House, they discovered an arch of the medieval bridge. The developers said they'd save it for £10,000, but they couldn't raise. Spab tried desperately, and others, to save the arch and raise the £10,000. It was a rather disgraceful episode involving the antiquaries when Hercules Reed, sorry, this is another lecture, wrote to the Times telling people not to contribute to the fund because the money could be spent on better things. Anyway, on the anniversary of that, London Spab commissioned an archaeologist to do a desk-based survey, and it looks pretty clear that the abutment should be underneath the garden at the south end of the Magnus the Martyr churchyard. So hopefully we'll persuade at some point Magnus the Martyr to allow us to put in a trench and hopefully discover the north abutment of the bridge. Sorry for that extended comment.
I just have a very straightforward question. Chaucer's lavatory, what was the wood?
Elm.
Elm, it was elm.
Yep. It was all
And it flushed, so to speak.
Well, we think so. Actually, the lavatory wasn't found, was probably just beyond my trench. But the drain, which was boxed in elm boards, very carefully made, with a buckler in. Who threw a buckler, a complete buckler down the loo? I don't know. But there must have been a garderobe immediately. Well, maybe they dug it, I don't know, on the new excavation. But it was behind, it would have been behind the basement wall. So all we had was the drain running along the southeast corner of the site. But elm absolutely is very common for that sort of thing.
This gentleman at the front.
Okay, Gustav.
Thank you.
Is that Gustav? This is Gustav.
Yes.
He knows far more about the waterfronts than I do. He's done all the work for 10 years there, and he was my absolute star person on the dig at the end when
Blah, blah, blah.
he came.
Yes, well, Tim has done well to mention Grimes's work, etc., etc. But it has to be said that Tim kick-started the London Museum, or the Museum of London's medieval waterfront project, which has international consequences just with the artifacts, has enormous topographical consequences, social and economic consequences. It was an amazing sort of 50-year excavation project, which was resoundingly successful. As you say, when you started, nobody thought there was anything medieval to find. And because of you and the work you did, you kick-started an amazing project and my career, for which I'm eternally grateful. You are the godfather, godmother, whatever you want to be, of the London Medieval Waterfront Project, and you should be proud of that. And we, from the Museum of London, are intensely proud of it. What you also did was taught us how to dig. This man had enormous charisma and enormous courage. And, you know, phrases like, dig down a couple more meters and see what's down there, is amazing. If you think about the time, people like the wonderful Philip Barker would excavate sites looking at the wear patterns on pebbles. This man dug 15-foot deep holes. He had the courage to do it, and it takes courage to do that in 11 weeks. He taught the Museum of London how to dig using Mortimer Wheeler's trench principles, and yet we pretended it was all done with matrices. It wasn't. It was done with Wheeler's principles and Tim Tatton-Brown's charisma, and we're eternally grateful. His legacy is enormous. So I'm going to thank him for his lecture, but thank him more than anything for teaching the Museum of London how to dig waterfront sites and get the potential out of them. We are very grateful. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Gustav. But he was my star pupil, you see. I remember the Sunday morning he turned up and asked me what I was doing, and he wouldn't go away. He was saying, what? And I said, well, looking for the bottom, you know, the rude remark we made, well, what are you looking for? And he came back the following day, and he learnt how to use a shovel and shovel up 15 feet and all the rest of it, and then stayed on. I went back to Libya after this.
Well, that seems rather an appropriate moment at which to start a party, to be honest. You know, with the godfather, grandfather and father of London waterfront archaeology here. For any of you that haven't bought a ticket to the 12th night party, then Anne Hignell, who will stand up, and she might already actually be preparing outside, but Anne Hignell or myself will take cash very happily to join in. It's sort of £15 a head. You know, but if you're only going to stay for a glass of wine, we might just about manage to sort of squeeze you a glass of wine for free before you go. Otherwise, could I, you know, ask you all to thank Tim Tatton-Brown for a charismatic lecture once more.
Hope that ramble was what you wanted.